thank you all for being here. It's very nice to see you and take part in this online symposium this afternoon. As Irena said, we're partners together in rescue, and she's told you the conceptual and background of the idea, and I'll be repeating some of what she said, but explain the project a little bit from my perspective. First, just briefly, my name is Zahra Mani. I'm a musician and composer and also a curator. I'm from London, as you can hear, so please tell me if I speak too quickly. But I've been living in Austria for the last 20 years. My academic background is German language and literature and philosophy. And so in combination with music, basically everything that I do has to do with spaces between. And I suppose my approach generally is to see analysis and abstraction as the starting point for creative expression and for communication. So that's kind of my approach to our engagement with industrial sites, abandonment, and their possible futures too. As far as rescue is concerned, I'm also the director of Klanghaus Untergreith, which is both an artistic organization and a house, an actual house in southern Styria, which is close to the Slovenian border in Austria, very close to Maribor, in fact, equidistant between Maribor and Graz. So a lot of our work, again, has to do with borders, the Alp-Adriatic region, and we try to engage very much with bringing international art and culture to the periphery. So our focus is much more on rural spaces and art and culture away from urban centers in an egalitarian exchange again, so that artists engage with other landscapes and audiences broaden their perspectives too. We collaborate a lot across borders. We also, our main event is probably the Klangzeit Festival, which tends to take place 3 or 4 times a year in South Styria, but also with partner organizations in Istria, in Hrelji, and with international organizers and partners. We focus mostly on performance art, music, sound art, but also spoken word, and above all, interdisciplinary exchange. That's what I'm particularly interested in speaking to you all today, because I think that crossover and exchange is incredibly enriching and important for what we do. As you all know, probably, Rescue is an EU project, and we started working on a European level in 2010 with an initiative called FONART, the Lost Languages of Europe, where we treated not just forgotten and dying dialects and languages as languages, but also contemporary art voices as threatened languages that need to be upheld and exchanged. And from 2016 to 18, we were also involved in Echoes from Invisible Landscapes, which was an Alp-Adriatic project inviting artists and local inhabitants to engage together in layers of history and not necessarily making the invisible visible, but becoming aware of it through art and culture. So those are our 2 best practice models that were recognized by Brussels and Austria as such. And we were delighted to be invited to be part of Rescue. As Irena told you, Rescue is the regeneration of disused industrial sites through creativity in Europe. And the lead partner of the project, I just need to give you some structural background, so maybe you understand how it works a little bit. The lead partner is the Comune di Santo Stefano di Magra in Liguria. And I think that their prime motivation, apart from collaborating across borders for the project, was that they have a factory, a ceramics factory, Vacari, that it's a huge aerial that's been partly regenerated. It's used by various groups, but they're trying to find ways of kind of sustainable futures in exchange with other organizations. And they're collaborating with the theatre, dance and performance group Liscardi, who do a lot of work with lay people, also with youth and with prisoners in the area, and take a quite performative and interactive approach to an applied approach to performance and industry. The other partners, I'm not going to tell you anything about XLP and Kibla because Peter and Irena can do that better. And eBook is the other partner from Saxony in Germany, and they have an annual art and craft festival in industrial sites where people come from all over the world. They even managed to do it last year, amazingly, and make temporary art in an abandoned site that gets taken away again. And this idea of temporality is also quite interesting to me and to us. So basically rescue is, as Irena said, about industrial heritage. It's about meanings and significances of labor, social transformations of concepts about pertaining to workspaces, to work. Obviously, it's also about cultural heritage and outreach. With artistic approaches that we all invite artists to be involved and engaged in the project, we're hoping that exchange, collaboration, dialogue, and innovation can happen to the extent that using and interpreting industrial spaces can kind of have the impetus to become a more inclusive creative process for audiences too. Obviously, we've got new challenges in times of COVID, but I'll come back to that in a minute. Briefly, just because the European aspect of the project is really important, it might be interesting for you. I don't know how many of you have been involved in European projects, but Rescue is a smaller scale cooperation project co-funded by the Creative Europe program of the EACEA. And Europe obviously has a bit of an understandable agenda as to why they invest money in culture, which wasn't necessarily foreseen in the Maastricht Agreement. And happily, in the last year or two, long after we started European projects, it's starting to the focus is starting to shift again away from creative industries and to aesthetic value for its own sake and creative art. So it's something that's quite a privilege to be involved in this upholding the value of European art and culture by doing something like this. The EU places a lot of emphasis on transnational collaborations and movement, which is naturally also a challenge at the moment, and we're still hoping and planning that we can all visit each other's sites later this year. Audience development's also very important. There's no point in making art for bubbles. And audience development just doesn't just mean getting hold of a lot of people, but it also means really involving people in creative processes and possibly opening minds and societies to a broader understanding of what culture is for us. And by communicating across boundaries, as we do across genres, I quite strongly believe that the diversity of European culture and the cultural landscape can reveal a common ground and thus have a socio-political impact that I think we should all certainly be interested in. But to get back to Rescue, a quite simple structure. Rescue intends to be workshops, artistic interventions, accompanied by research into best practice models of other places where these things are happening. Like Irena mentioned, there are many sites in Maribor alone, but we'd quite like to put together a kind of cartography of peripheral industrial sites that are being regenerated and the ways they're being regenerated. Because we all know big urban centers with lots of money that do these things, but it's interesting to see how smaller grassroots initiatives happen and can maybe connect with one another. And through analyzing them, possibly, hopefully, we'll move into further collaborations. Ideally, we want to have transnational performances in our sites, and at the end of the project, we'll definitely be producing an interdisciplinary book as a kind of catalogue that should stand in its own right, hopefully with contributions by some of you. Don't know whether you know that yet. Yeah, not just to document the project, but to really have a written and printed piece of work that reflects the diversity of the project better than some other individual elements can. Naturally, the idea was to get artists and school children into the spaces to create things in them, to engage with their histories and structures and transform them and imbue them with new aesthetic significances. We're working at the moment, and that was not something we were planning to do for Rescue, but obviously because of Corona, on a new platform that we call CHIP, which is a cultural hybrid interactive platform, where we basically use 360-degree panorama imagery as a stage for artists to enter and then engage with the space with sound or light, spoken word, recordings, superimposed imagery, that we then publish as videos online. That should be coming quite soon, our first editions, and that are then visitable completely normally on a two-dimensional screen by audiences who can explore the space with a mouse and have kind of stereo effects on the audio, and somehow experience the space without naturally even pretending to try to replace anything physical. But that's definitely an interesting approach to space and the kind of the virtual analog paradigm. Just to give you an example, our choice of industrial site in Austria is an abandoned stone quarry in Aflens near Wagner, and it's a space that we approached because of its hiddenness and enormous scale. It's the size of 5 football pitches and enterable through a tiny little door under a hill that no one would usually see. Historically, it's a sandstone cave that, like most caves in Central Europe, I think, was formed paleontologically by the decline of prehistoric oceans. And you can still see the fossils in the stones today. And it's also the habitat for rare breeds of bats. So biologically and geologically fascinating. The stone was used by the Romans for the construction of Flavia Sorva, which was a huge settlement, and used throughout early modernism by the Habsburgs to build significant structures in Graz and also part of the Ringstraße in Vienna. And another particularly poignant, perhaps the most moving aspect of the cave, was that it was used by the Nazis as a concentration camp for the construction of war machinery, where prisoners were confronted with terrible, terrible living conditions and forced labor. And again, all traces of this, apart from the numbers of the workstations on the stone walls, have disappeared completely. So the camp that the prisoners, captives, and victims were housed in was destroyed immediately after the war in 1945. And all that remains is the shadow of this brutal workplace, with all of the cynicism that goes with this horrific misuse of labor and productivity, and very few eyewitnesses. So one of the things that we also see as our obligation in Rescue is to document the past and to communicate history in the sense of quite simply never forgetting. But in the larger perspective, yeah, rescue is really also specifically for us in Austria, we're moving through a huge historical perspective and continuum from deep time paleontological past to our now post-industrial, post-postmodernism, which I haven't even mentioned yet. Where are we today? What do we mean when we talk about labor? How do we use and misuse human resources? How do we produce? What do we produce? How do we deal with levels of visibility and invisibility? What do these spaces and what does their history and what do the people mean for society and value systems and a possible post-labor society? We talk about the idea of post-labor a lot, but we're not there yet. And how can we redefine ourselves and new paradigms that go beyond work roles and the value of people without a focus on labor? How do we want to plan our urban and our rural spaces? Can we even uphold the rural? Can we keep the periphery peripheral and valuable? Can we use art and culture, and can we use our engagement with space and history to bring people together on a more sustainable and social level? Is that what we want to do? And can we use art and culture? And is it fair to expect of us that we can act as catalysts to counteract fragmented politics that we might not agree with? I think for me, the answer is certainly yes. And I think that whether through activism or through holding up a light to a mirror to the past and to the present, we're obliged to postulate possible futures as part of what we do. And yeah, to that extent, that's the value, I think, of rescue. There's an inherent value in cultural practice and exchange. There's an inherent value in increase of knowledge and exchange of knowledge, and exchange between various approaches and futures. So by analyzing the spaces that we're using and by putting into practice, hopefully, physical and social regeneration strategies, what we're hoping for is a sustainable continuation and organic growth of ideas, which will go far beyond what we've actually undertaken to do now. And I really welcome opportunities like this to exchange different approaches to how we might work together or parallel to one another in doing that. And as Irena also mentioned earlier, and I also have to mention, COVID-19 is really constantly changing the way we work, but also the way we think and the way we use language. And I certainly see it in everyday news and communication and politics. And I think that it's also valuable to look at some key points, which in the case of rescue, I could summarize as labor, historical continuum, physical and social regeneration strategies, crossovers between industrial and social spaces, the cultural significance of socio-political exchange, gender, nationality, and status are also inherently involved. I haven't gone into a lot of detail on that. And ultimately, creative communication and social cohesion. But what do these mean? What do all these things mean, like mobility or culture or freedom or exchange, in times where the pandemic adjusts our paradigms? I think that everything needs to be looked at in that light at the moment. And yeah, in that sense, that's basically where rescue's at. And I'm really looking forward to your input and exchange as to where it might continue to go. So I'm really delighted to see you all here today, and thank you for your time. I hope I didn't go on too long, and I'll hand back to Irena.
Thank you, Zahra. I would just add to what you have just said about, I think it's nice that you actually wrapped it up with a list of words that need rethinking when it comes to new ways of being, living and working. And I would actually add to this, maybe, what are your thoughts on the access? Because the thing is, like, for example, the site that you have chosen, as you already mentioned, is a site that you almost invisible, even though it's there, as it's kind of hidden. I could imagine that a lot of cases that we will hear about today, they are quite huge because it's an industrial building or a complex, so maybe it's not so invisible by itself. But then again, there is this big question of access, like how do you access it, and is this working within COVID-19 restrictions? So this can also bring us back on this moment of what's happening with this 360 video, like what kind of access is this, and then for whom? So maybe if you can just shortly comment on this, and maybe this is a question that I would also like to, maybe some others participants could also address this issue.
Yeah, it's a really relevant question, obviously, in Corona times, because even if we're talking about huge spaces, we still can't have gatherings of more than a certain number of people. And partly, especially I know in the case of our partners in Germany, the sites are quite dangerous. Abandoned industrial sites have a tendency to fall down. So I personally don't believe that digital tools can ever really replace being in a space, the same way that we would be completely different if we were in a conference room together or in a theater. At the same time, I'm finding it fascinating. It's been a very quick, and it's still in progress, learning curve for me, working on this 360-degree kind of virtual reality platform. And one of the things I'd like to say about access is that it was very important to us not to get into virtual reality in the sense of omni-oral hearing and goggles, and be isolated from the rest of the world, because cultural perception happens collectively. So we wanted to have something that is at least accessible, that everyone sees the same thing or could eventually enter the same room and then create their own experience using a mouse. What these platforms, however, it's not all negative, is do make possible is a kind of interactive learning process. And our programmer is also a teacher. And it's very interesting to talk to him about pedagogic methods in communicating spaces. So we don't just need to have really good recordings of the room, but we can also build in elements of multimedia history, learning and information and things that lead you further. And somehow, without it ever being a physical space, you're still very much leading from, it's a bit like being in a virtual encyclopedia with physical elements. So you could visit the space theoretically and have a room that you enter that has a film projected in it, or that clicks you into further information, into videos or music or other rooms. So this kind of interactive digital environment, I think, can be very productive as far as accessibility is concerned. And I think it's also something that we'll continue working with even when we can hopefully one day re-enter spaces, because it's I mentioned earlier just that I'm a musician and I play instruments and I use electronics, and I find the combination of analog and digital just completely logical and useful. So yeah, another applied accessibility.
Thank you, Zahra.